of advice and support around net zero, something which is really important at the moment globally for the Scottish enterprise, for the Scottish government as well, and for all companies out there. And I'm sure a lot of them are realizing if, even through public sector contracts and through their own kind of private, if it's retailers, PQQs or tenders, there's getting a lot of questions are being asked around carbon footprinting and net zero, and we really want to support our Scottish companies in this area. So the event today is really just my part is the lead up to the Net Zero Accelerator tool that Francis Fraser is going to show you, and really just how we can support you with that net zero journey. Francis has already said we're part of the sustainability specialist team in Scottish Enterprise, and I would like to give you a little bit of an overview of our team of Scottish Enterprise and where we fit into this as well. Okay, a brief agenda. Apologies. So with Scottish, I'll give you an update on Scottish Enterprise and where we fit into that in the sustainability team. Really, what do we mean by net zero? Again, this is a terminology which really we've only been using for the past, 3 or 4 years. So what is it we actually mean by net zero? A really important part for me is for you to understand what are the business drivers. Why should you start a journey towards net zero? Why should you start quantifying your own carbon impacts and start to decarbonize? What are going to be the other business benefits from you? I don't think this should be just a drive by other people to tell you what to do. And I really hope you'll take on board that actually this could be really, really beneficial for your company. After that, I'll pass over to Fraser on the Net Zero Accelerator tool, and Francis will cover the Q&As at the end. And there's really no silly questions in this area at all. Okay, team, you can see top right-hand corner, we've got the motley crew up here in the sustainability team. It's a growing team where we were once quite a niche part of Scottish Enterprise. We're finding now, so much we're dealing with, if it's appraising funding or support, if it's supporting companies, so much of this is actually sort of now entwined with our goal towards net zero and the Scottish Government's goal towards net zero by 2045. So we're an expanding team, and what we will probably see in a month's time, we'll have two other people in our small group, just as we're that kind of expanding part of the organisation. So Scottish Enterprise, there may be people on the call who haven't been introduced to Scottish Enterprise, maybe other people who have worked, for years with Scottish Enterprise. We're Scotland's national economic development agency. We work alongside the South of Scotland Enterprise and the Highlands and Islands Enterprise as well. And we're in the middle, and we work very closely with those enterprises too. So, how do we put Scottish Enterprise into a sentence? I think for me, really what we're doing, we're using economic development to make Scotland a better place. And what we're really doing is supporting more jobs, but what's really important is better jobs. And now the emphasis is really on greener jobs as well. So how do we make sure with all of these global changes that we've actually got a workforce and the companies to actually deliver some of these changes as well? As always, we always talk about the 3 I's: innovation, internationalization, and investment. These are the key areas we work with companies, and this is all towards supporting economic development, but economic development decoupled from, sort of impacts of climate change as well. We work in the business growth services, and we tend to work with companies around the 10 to 250 mark, and those ones who are achieving those 3 I's: innovation, internationalization, and investment. But we do work with lots of global companies too, and we can work with smaller companies as well. So please don't ever hesitate to get in contact with us as well. We can sort of widen our scope, and we'll always be there to at least sort of guide and signpost you in this area. So what do we support? Net zero is obviously a big one. So how do we support companies in building a net zero and sustainability strategy? How do we support them with really practical actions they can take? Those quick wins you can get in your company, and those maybe longer term investments, which ultimately will be saving you money as well. We've produced diagnostic tools, and this is a really good example, the Net Zero Accelerator tool. How do we start developing? How do you start sort of understanding and managing your impacts and sort of producing those kind of action plans as well? Big focus at the moment, unsurprisingly, is around the energy crisis, and this has been a very difficult time for all the companies we're working with, and that's not just from sort of the large manufacturing plants we're working with, but anything from sort of pubs to retail as well. So again, where can we support you on energy efficiency, understanding what those technologies are and what the technology could suit you as well, to actually bring together those energy savings and also, to move you away from using fossil fuels onto things like renewables, and heat pumps too. Funding and loans, we're all very good in our team and knowing where we can access support and funding. So it's not just our internal Scottish enterprise support. That can be, with our colleagues at Energy Savings Trust who do a lot on sustainable transport. So if you're looking at EV vehicles, it might be, an interest-free loan for them. It could be like working with Business Energy Scotland to get an interest-free loan to put some of these, these technologies within your company as well, make these efficiency savings. Some of the biggies as well, Scottish Government, they got £34 million to support manufacturing companies when it comes to energy efficiency and decarbonising the manufacturing process. So again, we're pretty good at knowing where the pots of money are at the moment for support. So, very happy to discuss that with anyone. Okay, always worth just to say, we're not a standalone. We're part of Business Growth Services. We've got lots of other specialists as well, which can really, really support companies. Scottish Manufacturing Advisory Service working on productivity and efficiency, digital transformation. Our techie guys who can help anything from ERP systems to getting your business fully digital. Innovation as well. If you're looking at R&D or putting money into innovation, what support is there out there on doing that journey correctly, and also where you can get funding for that. Our colleagues at Scottish Development International helping you to trade globally and also to bring those inward investors into Scotland too. We've got lots of nice little niche ones as well that people don't know about, but are fantastic. Intellectual property, IP. So if you're early stage with your products, have you did all the right thought process when it comes to IP? Working with workplace innovation. So again, this is the area of, are you how are you getting the best out of your staff, and how's your staff getting the best out of your company as well? All in that umbrella of fair work. So are we getting fair wages for a fair day's work? Cooperative Development Scotland, if you're like an employee ownership or cooperatives, our little secret, which is fantastic, and any company can use this. We do have a fantastic research service. So let's just say you're wanting to know a little bit more about international markets for one of your products. Well, fantastic. They're the ones they've paid the money to access all this really good global information and data. And again, that's available to all Scottish companies. So do please get in touch. The great thing is if you get in touch with one person, Scottish Enterprise, we can open the doors to other areas as well. Okay, so we'll get stuck in. The climate emergency, when I was talking, maybe even going back 5, 6 years ago, we used to have to do a big introduction on what global warming is. I don't think there's anyone in this call who really needs that. I think everyone has probably aware of the changes already happening and how bad they could look like in the future unless we start reducing the amount of fossil fuels we're using, and start reducing the amount of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Again, from David Attenborough, right now we are facing a man-made disaster of global scale, our greatest threat in thousands of years, climate change. For me, we've got these very big global threats, but how do we actually translate all of that into what your company can be doing, and what it should be doing in this area? I think after the summer, we've seen droughts across across Great Britain, particularly in the sort of the south, the central, all the way up the east coast. So we're starting to see climate change already. We're having so much more cases of flooding, of droughts, of wildfire. This isn't out of the news, and this will continue as well. COP26, we had all eyes in Scotland last year on this. And again, this was really to start getting, the globally to sign up to commitments to reduce our carbon emissions. And again, this is where we're starting to talk about net zero. What we need to do by 2045 is for globally for us to actually reach net zero. And I'm going to show you a little slide on that next. So what do we mean when we're talking about net zero? We're looking at this balance. Okay, so we think globally, we've got our carbon emissions we're producing, and that might be from deforestation, from from burning fossil fuels. All of these activities will lead to carbon, methane, nitrous oxide emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, so what we want to do is start to reduce that as much as we can. And this is where we're starting to talk about things like renewables, about the move to green hydrogen, looking at things like heat pumps. So we can get, we can move away from things like using natural gas and petrol, starting to look at agriculture and how we're doing that. How are we getting our products? How are we doing this with keeping those emissions down as much as we can? Now, the world also soaks up. We also get, we have this balance where it's actually taking up carbon dioxide. So the other bit we can do is actually to start being better at this. Particularly in Scotland, we've got peatland restoration. Peatland's huge soaker upper of carbon. So if we can keep those so they're able to soak up and keep that in the ground, fantastic. That's what we're looking to do. Forestry is obviously another big one as well. So growing forests and peatland. Potentially, there's a technology will add to this as well. So sort of different kind of director carbon capture techniques. So again, it's kind of more kind of human-made way of soaking up carbon dioxide as well. So we need to have those in balance. So everything we're producing has to be the same as what we're able to actually take up as a planet, and that will give us net zero, and that will give us net zero by 2045. That is what the aim is globally. What I would say 2045, 2050, we've got two numbers here to work with. Scotland has signed up to 2045, which in most cases is 5 years earlier than many places. And again, when we're looking at companies, the sign up really is to 2050 if we're going to use something like the United Nations race to zero. So why 2045? Why 2050? The idea is that that's to keep our temperatures actually under 1.5 degrees centigrade. Okay, and we have to achieve that by 2045, not to stop climate change, this is already happening, but to stop this being catastrophic to humankind. Okay. So actually, I'll just go through this a little bit, just what that means to your company. I've kind of looked globally and then in Scotland. For your company, again, what you're looking at is that kind of balance. So can you reduce your carbon emissions, not just of your own emissions, but of your supply chain, of your products and how they get used and how they get disposed of at the end? And dependent, lots of companies are different about this. What we can start looking at is then an offsetting. So anything residual, any of those carbon emissions that you can't get rid of, then actually can we start looking at a certified and a good carbon offsetting scheme. And what we tend to look at carbon offsetting is a carbon plus. So are we making sure we've got the other kind of social and environmental benefits from that before we put money into any of these schemes? So again, when you hear companies saying that they're carbon neutral or net zero, that's exactly what they've done. And many of them will have only done that for their scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, which I'll go on to next. Okay, I don't want to get into too much of the nitty-gritty, but I think this is where, very quickly when we start looking at net zero and about quantifying. So how can we say we've got to net zero unless we've quantified? So this is a really key part of it. So when we hear the term carbon footprinting, this is exactly what we're doing. It doesn't take long before you start hearing people like myself and consultants talking about scope 1, scope 2 and all this wonderful carbon jargon. So I just thought a little bit of overview for this can be quite helpful. And apologies, I'm telling people to suck eggs because you may already know this, but it's worth for those people who maybe haven't to go through what we really mean. Um, what's worth saying, we do have a global standard that pretty much the majority of companies will use to develop their carbon footprint to make sure everyone's more or less doing it the same, and that's the greenhouse gas protocol standard. And this is where this diagram is from as well, and this is where we start getting this kind of segregation of different types of emissions. One thing it's worth looking at is, first of all, we talk about carbon emissions. We're actually not really talking about carbon emissions, we're talking about carbon dioxide emissions. And not only that, we're actually talking about carbon dioxide equivalents. So we already have within those carbon conversion factors you'll use. So, for example, to change how much electricity in kilowatt hours that you're using, to change that into what that means in carbon, that figure will already include the emissions, the methane emissions, nitrous oxide emissions. If you're using anything like refrigerant gases on site, they're already sort of included. These are much more potent than carbon dioxide. So someone's already done the calculations that over a 100-year period, what the equivalent is in carbon dioxide. So for example, things like nitrous oxides, I think it's 330 times more carbon intensive than carbon dioxide, a lot more greenhouse gas intensive than carbon dioxide. So again, it's trying to get a figure. So we're not playing about with lots of different greenhouse gases and getting everyone confused. So that's what we're talking about carbon emissions. We're talking about carbon dioxide equivalents. Okay, so for companies, scope one emissions is where you'll start off with, and these are your direct emissions. So think about your facilities and think about your vehicles and think about where there would be greenhouse gases coming from those facilities or vehicles. So a vehicle, that will be your fuel usage that you're using if you're using diesel or petrol. In your facilities, that will be things like natural gas. It'll be, if you're using LPG, if you're using diesel, if you are burning that, you're creating greenhouse gases. You might have a chiller, a cold room where you're using refrigerant gases, which are global warming. And again, they would need, if there's top ups, we'd need to include all those. So it's not that if you, unless you've got the multi-site, this is not an onerous thing to do. If you got the information, your gas bills, how much LPG you're getting delivered, how much electricity you're using for your gas bills, is all quite easily to access this information to start building your scope one direct carbon emissions. Scope two, indirect. Again, this is relatively simple. This is just electricity for most companies. If unless you're actually buying steam from another, or heating or cooling from another company, which unless you're maybe from near an energy for waste site, it's unlikely. Scope two emissions. What we're looking at is how much electricity are you using on site, and then starting to convert that into carbon. What we use, it's great. We've got lots of very good information in the United Kingdom. We've got the UK government have actually got carbon conversion factors, so it's relatively easy to say, well, I'm used this much kilowatts of electricity this year, and multiplying it by the conversion factor to then find out actually what your electricity usage is at. So that's a kind of in a nutshell. That's really interesting. We have lots of companies who don't go any further than that, and they will claim that they're carbon neutral. They'll calculate that, reduce a little bit, and offset, and that will be, net zero. So we need to be very careful just understanding what a company means by net zero, because indeed, for the majority of the times, this is actually only 90% of your emissions. No, sorry, only 10% of your emissions. Many times, 90% of your emissions is actually your indirect emissions. What we're looking at here is for example, the product and the materials that you're using. So if you're getting, for example, ingredients or packaging materials, to make those, there's a carbon impact of that. So it might be where they're getting extracted from, how they're extracted. It might be how they're getting grown. So how much fertilizer is being used, for example. And all of this will then add up. They'll have the primary processing, transportation to your place. It already has a carbon emission before it even gets to your site. So you can start saying scope three does start getting a much more difficult process to really understand what your carbon emissions are. And not only that, it's not even going into your site. What happens at the end? So a product you're selling, for example, what happens at the end of life? That might have a carbon emission associated. When it's in usage as well, that might have a carbon emission associated. So you can see scope three gets much wider. Other scope three emissions, most companies will start to measure things like how much waste they're producing on site, their water usage as well, commuting, employees going to your site. Even now, home working, if you're working from home at the moment, you might have switched on your energy. You wouldn't have done that if you weren't in the house. Well, that energy is actually part of the scope three emissions of the company you work for too. Okay. Business travel is another big one. So again, particularly international travels, that starts to really mount up on your carbon figures. For me, this is really, really important because it starts recognizing your hot spots. For everyone, we're all quite visual creatures, so we'll start to look at our own premises. But until you know the whole picture of your company, it's very hard to say, well, actually, do you know what? Our electricity is tiny compared to actually the ingredients we use. Okay. But the thing is, we may be able to influence our electricity more than we can on the ingredients. So again, there's a little bit of, what can we do, what can we do now? Where are the quick wins? And what, given this is a 20-year journey, what do we know we're going to have to deal with in 5, 10, 15 years as well? And that's where you start getting a really kind of good decarbonisation plan. And again, this is where the net zero accelerator tool comes in, because you can see from that, if we're going to look at scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, really every aspect of your company, if it's your own procurement, if it's, how you're dealing with your waste, if it's what kind of packaging you're bringing in on site, all of these will impact your carbon footprint, and all of these should be taken into consideration. Don't want to frighten anyone away. Again, most companies start with scope 1, start with scope 2, easy to calculate scope 3. So starting to build up this picture as best you can. I assume there's lots of SMEs on this call. Again, we don't want to be frightening people away, but there is this kind of nice kind of stepped process by starting with your scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. So why would we do all of this? I think for this is really just what I've gleaned over the years from companies and the reasons that they are working towards net zero. Lots of companies, I'm finding the leaders and the staff actually, within their own lives are really starting to look at their own impacts, and they really do want to do the right thing. And for me, this is probably one of the best drivers you can have. Just realizing actually, we do need to be on board with making these changes. Getting the best employees has been really interesting, working with people in sort of in the oil and gas sector, where, they put jobs up for, I think, a very well-paid software engineer. In the end, only one person came to interview. They phoned everybody else up, and, everyone's like, "Well, why do I want to work for oil and gas?" So again, this kind of just transition. We've got, Generation Z, the millennials are all wanting to start actually really wanting to work for a company the ethos is the same as theirs. So this, I think, is going to be a very important area, that getting this right alongside things like fair work, to make sure that you're getting the best employees. I've highlighted this in red because I still think this gets lost under net zero. So much of this is to do with reducing your overheads. We've talked about things like gas and LPG and electricity. Efficiency first with everything. Efficiency, looking into renewables for cheaper energy production as well, long term. So looking at reducing your overhead. So what we'd want to say is this at least the kickoff is going to be saving you money. And we know that's where the sweet spot is. So it's saving you money, and really being able to show those that percentage of decrease in the amount of carbon dioxide you're producing on your site, your carbon dioxide equivalents. Marketing as well, you probably noticed, we've got lots of companies now. We need to be very careful of greenwashing, but this really does show that, if they have a good net zero plan and some really good practical actions you've already taken in, it's clearly part of your marketing. How do you distinguish yourself from your competitors? And this really is a way many companies are doing this. Reducing risk, actually, within the tool we look at this kind of risk reduction, particularly around climate change. So, we have had, funny enough, because we've done this with many companies, and one that comes up a lot is flooding. Sites getting flooded, and so we're starting to understand that impact of climate change on your business. Is some of the produce you're going to get, is it still going to be grown locally? Is that going to change in 5, 10 years' time? So it's just to do that little bit of a risk assessment. What is global warming going to do to your company? Okay. But also on the actually just those risks of markets as well. So for example, even things like beef and dairy industry, might there be a reductions in that if people are moving towards flexitarian or becoming vegetarian? So understanding the markets as well, and the market drivers, to make sure that you're keeping up with what the direction consumers are going to as well in this area. New business opportunities. Again, with these consumers changing things, one, a really good example we've got of a Scottish company, actually getting an advantage by keeping an eye on what the situation is. We've got a company who does sort of dry cleaning, a very environmentally friendly cleaning for things like the wedding industries, which actually went down, particularly over COVID. There's less people that can get a cheap suit anyway, so lots of people do that instead of maybe going to the rental market. So they've seen that reducing. But what they did see is actually this rental market for things like we've got lots of different companies who are now starting to sell, very high end dresses, for example, for people to wear once. So again, if you're going to a party, do we buy you buy your dress once? What is much better than spending, I don't know, 200, 300 pounds and something that might lie in your wardrobe. So again, it's understanding those new markets. They understood those markets are really looking for the environmental credentials as well, and have worked very, very hard as a company on that. Another really important one, I think, for the people on this call, alongside reducing your overheads, is actually getting those contracts. And for me, this is really important. I've got lots of companies who've done fantastic things around energy efficiency, for example, but haven't translated that necessarily into the language that we're now seeing in things like PQQs and tenders. So again, having a good plan and a well thought out plan, we really do hope will help Scottish companies get those contracts, and that this isn't just like sort of public sector contracts, but this is for all. Particularly within the food and drink sector, I've worked with one company who have said they were close to losing 50, 60 employees at their site because they had a new tendering process to go through, which then started talking about sustainability. They were scratching their heads what net zero was, what biodiversity action plans were, and had to very quickly pull something together. They just got through, and no more. And that was with the help with our sustainability team. And they are very happy to say that that actually would have been huge job losses at that site if they hadn't have got their head around this. So contracts will be lost. This is being really pushed heavily with, particularly with the big sort of supermarket retailers, on their supply chain, reporting on their emissions and reporting on how they're going to reduce their emissions. Again, and we see this a lot in SE. On the funding side, getting public sector funding and actually private investment as well, if that's equity, if that's loans, they're starting to ask questions, on your company and on your products as well. So I think having that, very clear, clear information of why your company and why your product fits into the whole kind of net zero world is very important. Okay, that's everything from me. I'm going to pass you over to Fraser, and I look forward to some of the Q&A.
Mastered this. We're getting there, but if there are any um, sort of issues that we encounter, then apologies in advance. I'm juggling with a couple of different windows here. But yeah, so thanks very much, Alison. So my name is Fraser Miller. I work in the team with Alison, the sustainability specialist team. And I think Alison's done a really good job of sort of explaining the different tools that we have at our disposal, the different ways that our team can help businesses of all sizes, not just your larger ones, but certainly SMEs as well. And one of the ways that we can do that, this is the reason I'm kind of here today to talk to you, is through use of our, I'll say it's newly launched. It previously was in an offline format, but we've now launched quite recently our online net zero accelerator. So it's now online, where previously it was a pen and paper exercise. So we call this the Net Zero Accelerator, or the NZA for short. And I'll just spend about 10-15 minutes running you through this today. I'm going to provide a brief run through, explain how you can complete it, what the outputs are, that kind of thing. But crucially, I'm going to explain why it's important for businesses to kind of to partake in the exercise. And I think that runs on nicely from what Alison was talking about, and that's just the myriad reasons why pursuing sustainability and net zero is beneficial to your business. Yes, it's about doing the right thing, we know this, but businesses aren't going to do it just through altruism. Want to see an impact on their prospects, safeguarding their future, see an impact on their bottom line, essentially. I should say as well, I've also prepared just a quick guide to the tool, which I won't go into in any detail during the session today, but I believe Francis is going to circulate after. And this is just a sort of a how-to guide, which will help you get the most out of the tool and just explain any elements that I don't manage to cover during the brief session today. So the Net Zero Accelerator is a self-diagnostic online tool. This means users are able to go through it at their leisure. Previously, you would have to book a session with myself or someone else on the team, and that meant having to marry up our diaries, which isn't always easy because you understand how busy businesses can be. So you can do it in your own time. You can do it over multiple sessions. If you've got 10 minutes here and there, you can log back in and out at your leisure. And it should only take about 30 minutes to complete. Now, I've heard some businesses taking less than this, some taking more. There's a few reasons for this, which I'll go into. But essentially, it involves answering 5 sets of 5 multiple choice questions. And don't worry, I will go into the tool. I'll do a live sort of run through the tool in just a minute or so. Each question also has a free text option underneath it, and that's just for adding additional information that you might want captured. Now, the reason for this is that all the specialists on the team have the facility to go into the tool and they can see your answers. They can see how if you've added any free text. And if you want, following the tool, then you're more than welcome to follow up with one of us to discuss your answers, discuss your score, and to sort of discuss what next steps are available, practical, actionable in the short and medium and long term. So as I say, questions are split into 5 categories. Each one focuses on a different element of net zero. So the categories are, and apologies, I'm just reading this off a list, understanding your carbon impacts, setting targets and reducing those impacts, leadership and staff engagement, collaborating, supporting and innovating, and finally, climate change and market trends. Now, the last one there is very much what Alison was talking about, the wider impacts of climate change and its effect on businesses. If you are growing locally, is that going to be possible in the future? Is climate change going to maybe force you to rethink your supply chains, that kind of thing? After completing the tool, users are given a score out of 5 for each of the sections and a total score of 25 for the entire exercise. You're then presented with a results report, which is automatically generated upon completing the tool. And this is bespoke to your answers, to your responses to the questions. And it will show areas where your business is doing quite well as where improvement is likely going to be needed. So the report itself has been designed to provide a lot of different advice at different levels, as well as guidance, practical actions. There's a lot of really useful links and recommendations in there for businesses at all levels. So if you're just starting out with net zero, or if you've already been on the journey for a couple of years, say, there should be good advice and good actionable recommendations for businesses, regardless of what level they're at. So I'm now going to try and jump into the tool, and I use the word try because we'll see how this goes. I'm sure it will be fine though. So I'm just going to very quickly hopefully I've managed to jam it so I'm still looking into the camera. So what you should see in front of you is the Scottish Enterprise Sustainability Support for your business page. Now, there's a lot of really useful resources here that Alison's gone through some of these in a bit of detail. I'm only really going to talk about the Net Zero Accelerator, so that's right here. A link to this page, I should say, is in the guidebook that will be circulated after the session today. So we access the tool just by clicking this hyperlink, which should be here. Yes, and Basically, if you're accessing it for the first time, you'll be asked to register. So we'll go into a very short registration page, which I won't labour for too long, just to point out a couple of bits of information that are useful. We are very keen to understand what enterprise area your business is located in, and this is just because if you're in Highlands and Islands or if you're in South of Scotland, we want to direct either Highlands and Islands Enterprise or South of Scotland Enterprise to talk to you after the session if you so wish. So it's useful for us to know, but it also gets the most direct support to yourselves, the most appropriate support. Also interesting to understand what sector your business represents. Hopefully in time, we are going to build up a suite of responses that will allow us to benchmark the different sectors to understand, let's say, the engineering sector. So if an engineering firm goes in, uses the tool, they can see how they score in relation to other businesses in that sector, competitors, that kind of thing. So I think that's a really useful element of the tool. Finally, just to mention size, very important here, and I think Alison touched on it. We offer support to businesses at all sizes, at all levels. So whether or not you're a sole trader completing this tool, if you're an SME, you're a multinational, we can offer support, but that support is dependent often on the size and status of your business. So it's important for us to understand what size your business is too. Right, so after registering, your email address you'll receive a ping with your username and your password. So then we just go on to save and continue, which obviously I won't get past at the moment because I haven't completed it. And then we jump in here. So I'm just going to use my own login credentials here. So I've already done this previously. So as I say, it's just your username, which is often your email address, and your password. And then we just sign in. So you immediately, upon sign in, you'll see that your company name is at the top. So that's Demo Company if you're me. You'll also see a little list here of all the sessions that you have previously completed. So for many businesses that are registering and using the tool for the first time, they won't see anything other than new session, which just means there's a blank form for you to go ahead and fill in. Now, I've already filled this in once for the purposes of this demonstration and a few others I've given, so I have the option to jump into session 1. You'll see that I completed this back in March, which is quite a long time ago now. But for most businesses, they'll only have the option to jump into a new session. So I'm just going to go and take you through session 1, which I've already completed. It'll just make it a little bit quicker, I think. And that's us into the tool. So what you'll immediately see is there's a bit of introductory text here, as well as questions 1 to 5 of the tool. So if you scroll down here a bit, you see questions 1 to 5. Now, apologies for scrolling up and down. I'll try and go through the questions in a bit more detail. But yeah, essentially it gives you an overview of what we're asking about, what the different areas we're going to focus on. So that's the 5 that I mentioned previously. Just reiterates it should take about 30 minutes to complete. Now, I've already completed the tool, so it says 100% complete here for me. If you are going in for the first time, it'll obviously say 0% complete, and that will obviously get incrementally larger the more questions you answer. One final thing to note is that there is a small glossary of terms here. Hopefully you can see that. Now, again, this sort of harks back to what Alison was saying about there's quite a lot of jargon in net zero and things like that. And especially if a business is quite new to net zero and to sustainability, there might be some terms used in the questions that you're not immediately familiar with. So we use this glossary of terms just to help familiarise you with some of the more technical elements of what we're here to discuss. So there are 5 sections, as I say. Section 1 is obviously understanding your carbon impacts, as we mentioned. Now you can navigate between the sections quite easily, so there's tabs here to make sure you don't miss anything out. Also use ticks to indicate that section's complete. So there are 25 questions. I'm not going to read out all 25 questions because I think we'll be here till after lunch. So I will just pick out a few, one from each section, to give you a flavour of what we're actually looking for, the kind of information that helps us accurately judge where you sit within the net zero spectrum, how far you've come in terms of the progress you've made. So with question 1, we're basically asking, we have an understanding of our company's carbon impacts, for example, the carbon impact of our own operations, supply chain, products, services, investments, customer impacts, and disposals. So each question follows an identical format. There is a question, there is a bit of subtext here. So what we're asking here is, this doesn't mean you've quantified your impacts. You don't have a data-driven plan yet, but rather you have thought about your impacts. You've got a feel for what your main emitters might be. Maybe you think, or you have an appreciation that energy is quite intensive. Maybe some of your processes are a bit more, a bit less streamlined than perhaps they could be. Every question as well has the exact same multiple choice responses. So a business is able to say that there's no action being taken with respect to a question, or they are planning to implement something, partially in place, mostly in place, or fully in place. There's also a not applicable option, which I would say you can use in a few of the questions, but mainly this wouldn't be relevant. However, some businesses have used this in place of no action taken, which I would suggest it's not a good idea to do that, because it means your score is not going to be accurate. If you haven't done anything in respect of a certain question, that's fine. Just be honest and say we haven't done anything yet, and we can direct support to you in line with that. So there's free text as well for every question. Now, I will say there's absolutely no need to put in free text for every question. You can put it in if you think there's a good chance that you will be picking up with a specialist after the session. Because, as I say, we can go in and we can read your responses, we can read what you've written in your free text, and we can just use it to get that little bit more information about where you are with respect to a particular question, a particular section of net zero. So right here, for the sake of my demo company, I've said that we have question 1 partially in place. Sorry, I've just seen that Philip can only see the registration screen and not the presentation.
It's okay, Fraser, I'm on it. It's a local issue too, Philip. I'm sorting it. Thank you.
Okay, no problem. So in terms of the free text, yeah, I've just responded. We understand that our operations have environmental consequences. However, we don't know the extent of these. For example, we use a lot of energy, but we haven't quantified exactly how much. We're not sure how this translates into carbon. There are areas of our operation that we understand the environmental consequences, but we need to do this more fully. So partially in place. And it's just a case of them working through the questions. So I'm not taking us through every single question, but as I say, you don't need to put in free text for everything, just the ones that you feel you've got a bit extra to add. So with section 2, which we're obviously focusing on setting targets and reducing impacts. Question 1 here, our company has made a formal commitment to reach net zero across scopes 1, 2 and 3 by at least 2050 with interim targets set. So a lot of the questions are asking about very specific elements of net zero and how your business is progressing with respect to, quite specific areas. So this is, do you have a formal commitment to reach net zero? Now, the subtext here basically explains we're not asking if you have a full net zero plan, that very few businesses will have, but we do want to know if you've made that commitment and in what form. So I've answered here, mostly in place for that one. And the rationale here is that we have made a declaration internally. However, we've not made this public yet. We're still writing the associated narrative around this. So we expect this to be completed and made public in the next few months. So I'd say, fair to say that that's mostly in place, but not fully in place yet. Moving on to section 3. We'll just pick question 3 here. So our employees are allocated responsibility to help reduce the carbon impacts of the business. So I would say this is a particularly important question, and the reason for this is so we can understand, is net zero just 1 or 2 employees working in an office independent of the rest of the organisation? They've been allocated, you have to get us to net zero, but ultimately it hasn't really changed the ethos of the whole organisation. Or is the organisation embracing net zero in a more holistic fashion? Is it embedded at all levels? So again, I've said mostly in place for this one. However, I haven't rationalised it, and that's absolutely fine. You don't need to put in free text. Section 4, is collaborating, supporting and innovating. And question 3 here is asking about if your business actively promotes and shares net zero activity to help influence other companies. So again, this is very important because I think it's generally very important to say net zero shouldn't be tackled in isolation. I think there's a lot to be gained from discussing with peers, with even competitors across industries, across all areas of business. If you have done something that's worked, if you have had a success in net zero, then absolutely you should be sharing that. If you don't share it, it basically means other organisations aren't privy to that information and they might take a longer route to get to where you are, or they might not be aware of a certain shortcut or a way to succeed in getting to net zero. So again, I put just fully in place. I haven't rationalised it, that's fine. And finally, section 5, climate change and market trends. So I'm going to pick up the question that Alison actually touched on during her presentation, and that's question 4. So we have considered the impact that the climate emergency will have on demand for our products and services. So this isn't net zero specifically, this is more about the wider implications of climate change, the climate emergency, and if demand is likely to change, and that means either go up or go down for your products and services. So for example, if you make something that's reliant on diesel or petrol or single-use plastic, for example, then you might find that demand is starting to drop or even collapse, and you might have to rethink business models. But conversely, if you are developing a new renewables technology, say you make components for ground source heat pumps, you'll find a huge uptick in your in demand for your products. So you'll have to adapt for that as well, and this is all related to the climate emergency. So, as I say, I've just picked out one question from each to give you a sort of flavour of what the different categories are actually asking for. So once you have completed all 25 questions, and you have to complete all 25 questions in order to be able to hit this button, which is gives you access to the bespoke Net Zero Accelerator report. So the reports all follow the exact same format. You'll have your company name at the top here. It'll tell you when you completed it, which for me was many months ago now. What I will say is it's fine to view the report in your browser, but I would say it's more effective if you can download it to either PDF or Word format, and I would recommend PDF. It's very user-friendly, it's good for if you're sending it round internally or externally. If you're wanting to chop bits out for reporting or board papers, I would use the PDF. It's also the quickest to load, which means we don't have to wait on the loading screen. So here we go. This is the report. This is probably the most important bit, the bit that most businesses are looking to obtain at the end of the session. So it's a very short, quite a concise report. There's only about 5 or 6 pages, the first of which is just telling you how the report actually works. So there are a range of recommendations further down, which we'll go through just quite quickly, but essentially businesses score out of 5 for each section and out of 25 for the report. So for each section, you'll get a score indicating whether or not you are at the initial stage of net zero, whether you are actively engaged, or whether you are demonstrating best practice. And that follows a red, amber, green format. So if you're tracking as initial stages for a particular section, then there will be actions highlighted that are aimed at getting you onto the next section. But before we go to the recommendations, there's just a little bit of data visualization, which is really useful as well. So this is just essentially a breakdown of your results by category in a really, breakdown of your results in a really accessible format. So we have section 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And as we can see, my business, the demo company, we're doing very, very well when it comes to collaborating, supporting, and innovating. However, when it comes to understanding our carbon impacts, we're kind of lagging behind a little bit here. And the table underneath is just another way of presenting the same information. Again, with section 1, we know that we're not doing particularly well. We've got area to improve here, but with section 4, we know we're doing really well here. We just continue what we're doing. There's maybe a few things we can do to progress, but really we want to be aiming at the sections where we're not scoring quite so high. We also have an average here, which is 3.8 out of 5. So we are tracking as actively engaged, which is fantastic. However, we know that to get this score up, we can then look at the recommendations on the following pages in order to get us to where we want to be. Ultimately, we want to be in the best practice kind of territory. So here we have recommended actions, and there are a set of recommended actions for every single category. So we have understanding our carbon impact, section 1, but we also have it for the other 4 categories. So we have our score here, 1.4 out of 5. It's not a particularly high score. So it stands to reason that our actions here, highlighted actions, are all initial stage. Things that we should be doing at the beginning of our journey to get a better understanding of, let's say, what carbon impacts are, what the scopes and quantification actually means, and how to progress to the actively engaged level and ultimately to best practice. So the report has a lot of different information and resources, and it's very, very useful. We've had really positive feedback from businesses saying that they have been able to progress and evolve their net zero ambitions based on the report that they've obtained at the end of the exercise. There's a lot of hyperlinks, a lot of information to digest. And I should say it's information at all levels. So even if a business is tracking as at the initial stage, we still offer actively engaged and best practice suggestions, because we know we don't want a business to have to complete the tool every single time they think they've made a bit of progress. This guide is basically there to be referred to time and time again in order to get you from one stage to the next and then to the next. So that's section 1. Section 2 follows the exact same format. Highlighted actions in yellow or actively engaged. We're using the actively engaged recommendations. Section 3. Section 4, we're in best practice. We know that because we saw it in the spider chart. So we've been suggested best practice recommendations for this. Finally, section 5, actively engaged. It's up to the user to work through these at their leisure. There's short, medium and longer term recommendations, resources, tools, a lot of helpful and useful links here that really should help progress to net zero in a more efficient and more holistic kind of way. And just like that, we're at the end of the Net Zero Accelerator. I should say, I mean, we've been working on this for quite a long time. We've had really good feedback from businesses of all sectors, all stages, all levels, saying that, you know, the resources are very helpful, that it does clarify how to get to net zero in a faster, more efficient way. What I've found when I've spoken to a lot of businesses that haven't engaged with the tool is that they've kind of hit a roadblock. They don't know how to get any further along. And I think this tool is an answer to that. So it is a dynamic tool. We will continually update the resources. We know that the net zero is it's a shifting landscape. So in order to keep this tool relevant and useful, we will be continually adding new resources as we go along. So that's the Net Zero Accelerator. Hopefully you found it useful. Thank you very much for listening to me today. And